Good morning, Hugh. How are we doing?
Well, we're doing great. We can talk for a while. I know you must have. Give me an idea how much time we have, Admiral, so I don't waste it.
I am wide open. So
Oh,
I just finished something else, and now I'm all yours, Hugh.
all right. Terrific, because we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about Turkey, Kurdistan, and Syria. Then we're going to switch to China because on your recommendation, I went out and read Graham Allison's Destined for War, and I'm very upset. And I went out
Yeah.
and I am reading Waiting by Ha Jin, and I think I know why you had me read that. So when Stavridis tells me to do something, I do what Admiral Stav tells me to do. So I'm ready to talk about those. But let's start because I have a different point of view on Turkey. I do not believe Turkey is going to go very far into Syria. I believe that they are making a gesture to firm up his domestic advantage. I don't think there's going to be a genocide. I don't think ISIS is going to run rampaging across the Syrian desert and into Mosul again. But you might disagree, and I'd love to hear. I want to hear what you think about this move.
I hope you're right. I desperately hope you're right, Hugh. And I think there's perhaps a 1 in 3 chance that you are right, that Erdogan prudently stops his advance kind of 5 miles into Syria, creates a safe zone, opens negotiations with the United States, which, by the way, were in progress before the now famous Trump-Erdogan phone call. So that could happen. But unfortunately, Hugh, as I look at President Erdogan, who I know pretty well and met with him multiple occasions when he was prime minister of Turkey and I was supreme allied commander, he's a risk taker. He has Ottoman-like visions of Turkey's place in the world. I agree there's a domestic component to this, but I think, Hugh, there's also a sense that this is Turkey's moment to act like a great power. And so you really see a kind of collision between the ancient, if you will, Ottoman Empire invading what was once the Arab Caliphate, Turks invading Arabs, and who's fluttering around on the sidelines that we ought to worry about? It's the Persians, now called the Iranians. So I think it's a very volatile mix. I wish the president had said to President Erdogan, hey, don't do this. Stop. Let's continue to work together. We've got a very good new Secretary of Defense in Secretary Esper. Put him together with General Secretary Hulusi Akar, the Minister of Defense of Turkey, and let them work this out. That was kind of in progress. Then I think this phone call really moved the goalpost for Erdogan in a way that encouraged him to take this leap. So 1 in 3, the Hugh Hewitt prescription occurs. It stops. We get a negotiation. ISIS doesn't come back. But I think there's a 2 in 3 chance it will, Hugh. That ought to worry us.
Now, Admiral, I want to talk to you about what my reporting is, and I've got some pretty decent sources on this, is that
Sure.
Erdogan adamantly told the president he was going to do this, that the American troops were where he was going to go, and the president was not going to get into a shooting war with Turkey. Now, that's a counterfactual to what happened because we withdrew. Great powers, as we learned from the Graham Allison book, sometimes have to take a loss. They have to walk backwards to avoid escalation. Do you believe Erdogan would have moved, or what do you put at the odds of Erdogan moving with American observers in his way?
I think very low. And that's why I think the president would have been better served to say to President Erdogan, that's just not going to work because we have Americans there. Let's let our ministers of defense get together and work out something before you leap across. I don't think Erdogan wants to take the risk of killing American troops. So we will never know the answer to that question because the president withdrew our troops from the path of the Turks. I think it would have been better to look Erdogan in the eye. And Turks, if you meet their gaze directly, they understand you're quite serious. Let me put it another way, Hugh. And you know me, I don't kind of do domestic politics, but here we see agreement between Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. We see agreement between Lindsey Graham and Bernie Sanders. Think about that for a minute. I think it's a hard case to be made that this is in any way anything other than a very difficult moment for the United States. I'll close with a historical analogy, by the way. Think about the Korean War, Hugh, and if when things got tough and we were taking a lot of casualties, we had said, those Koreans, they weren't with us at Normandy. Let's get out of here. Let's get out of this thing. We're losing troops. Let's just leave. If we had done that, what would the Korean Peninsula look like today? I think there are bigger equities here than just a tactical moment between the United States and Turkey, about which we need to be mindful.
And we will continue to check in on this. My counterfactual is that last week we talked about the great global competition of our time, which is on the sea, under the sea, and in space with anti-satellite weapons and with hypersonic missiles. That the future of America does not depend upon the border conflict between Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds. It depends upon huge allocations of assets and defense thinking to another sphere entirely, and that the president is trying to withdraw to defensible lines and doing so step by step. I will be wrong if the Kurds march in and a genocide occurs, or if the ISIS prisoners get loose. I will be wrong. But if they don't, I think Trump will get credit for this. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. And again, I'm here doing the odds. I think there's a 1 in 3 chance what you just described is how this plays out. I'm kind of on the darker side of the equation. And by the way, I agree completely. The big game, big casino is what's happening with the U.S. and China. But the deployment we're talking about here in Syria, Hugh, is only 2,000 to 3,000 U.S. troops. When I commanded the NATO mission in Afghanistan, we had 150,000 troops there. At one time in Iraq, we had 200,000 troops there. I think a small investment of 2,000 to 3,000 special forces in Syria to prevent that 2 in 3 dark side of the equation makes some sense and can be done alongside your absolutely correct assessment that the main ball here is preparing for China.
One more volley back and forth, because I'll let you have the last word. I went on an embedded assignment to Camp Bondsteel at the request of Colonel Kurt Schlichter many years ago. Colonel Kurt was the guy who wrote the column in which he pointed out the Kurds are our allies, but they've never been an expeditionary force on behalf of America, and we have often been an expeditionary force on behalf of the Kurds, so it's not really equilibrium. But I went to Camp Bondsteel with him, with his troops, and noted that we're there 20 years after our intervention in Kosovo. 20 years later, we've got, I think it's 10,000 American troops stationed in Kosovo. Some of these engagements inevitably suck up resources that we all need in an era when the Congress won't do its basic job of appropriating money for our troops. If they want to, and this is what I come back to, Congress can mandate a garrisoning of Syria. They can pass the money and mandate that it be spent there. They've never done that, Admiral.
Absolutely correct on all counts. And as you well know, back to the Korean Peninsula, we still have 35,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula. What do we get out of that? I would argue we get the 15th largest economy in the world, an ally, and a vibrant democracy that stands in a region against China, Russia, and North Korea. But is it worth 35,000 troops for 60, 70 years? I kind of think it is.
I agree.
I agree. Back to Camp Bondsteel, we are actually, small point, we're probably down to about 4,000 U.S. troops there. At one time, we had 15,000 when I commanded that mission. It is a NATO mission. And I think that's a less obvious case of a place to just keep U.S. troops. So each of these apples and oranges and hubcaps are kind of different.
Yeah.
On this one, I'd say on Syria, I'd say 2,000 to 3,000 troops feels about right. I would not advocate garrisoning in Syria. I wouldn't advocate long footprint, but I think of those 2,000 or 3,000 troops, Hugh, as leverage to get a lot done in a very turbulent place.
All right, we will check back in on that. Now I want to switch to China. In our last conversation, the Admiral gave me homework. Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, The Thucydides Trap. I am about 95% done with it. I'm about half done with the novel Waiting by Ha Jin, also assigned to me by the Admiral. And the consequence of this is sleepless nights. It really is. There are so many ways for the U.S. and China to end up in a hot war that are gamed out by Graham Allison, that I walked away thinking to myself, the odds there are pretty dark about that kind of a confrontation coming somewhere. Do you Do you agree with that?
Unfortunately, I do. And we should park for a minute on the title of the book. It's Destined for War. There's no question mark at the end of that. It is a disturbing analysis of history, as you know, but for our listeners, Graham looks at 18 cases across 2,000 years of human history, going back to the ancient Greeks, the Athenians, and the Spartans, 18 occasions in which an established power is challenged by a rising power. And in 12 of those occasions, a global war ensues. Last time it happened, 100 years ago, established power, Great Britain, rising power, Kaiser's Germany. So in this 21st century, established power, United States, rising power, Germany, rising power, China. How do we avoid that so-called Thucydides trap? And I would argue we need that mix of economics, politics, culture, military capability for deterrence in case things go bad. We're going to need all those things if we're going to avoid that Thucydides trap. And I'm with you. It's sleepless going forward.
Now, the two examples he gives that give us some hope are the U.S.-USSR competition, and I think even more tellingly, the U.S.-UK competition in the late 19th, early 20th century, where the United Kingdom basically reconciled themselves to not being number one, but to being very intertwined with number two so that number two could come to their aid when World War II broke out and when they withdrew east of Aden. I don't know that we can get there with China because the systems are so different. But there is a very, very good chance that we could figure out a way to evolve with China if we're candid. And I look at incidents like the NBA collapse in the front of Chinese pressure this week and say that is not the way to co-evolve in a productive way. That's the way to give Xi Jinping exactly the wrong input.
And you are exactly correct. And another important one to look at are the demonstrations in Hong Kong. Now, I don't think we should be taking on a military campaign to support. I don't think we should be engaged with the CIA or our intelligence. But we ought to give our verbal support to people who are demonstrating, by and large peacefully. There have been some violent moments, but by and large peacefully, to obtain what they were promised when Hong Kong came away from Britain and became part of China. We ought to support that. And by the way, a huge element in all this going forward in the U.S.-China relationship, Hugh, is going to be Taiwan, which is watching closely what's happening. Taiwan's a pretty big place, millions of people. It's the 25th largest economy in the world, Taiwan. And so we ought to be supportive of the norms that we believe in forthrightly. That doesn't mean we're on a collision course, doesn't mean we're trying to overthrow the Chinese government, nor are they trying to overthrow our government. But we are going to have to be forthright in how we deal. We're going to have a capable military because deterrence matters. And we're going to have to create workable economic incentives and intertwinement, if there's such a word, between the United States and China over time.
And candor and great explicit statements of what we think are red lines. It's not the 9-dash line. It's not this oil platform there or that artificial island here, but a Tiananmen-like event in Hong Kong. I think the Chinese just have to know the reaction in the West would shut down, right? It would be shut
Correct.
down. The NBA would not care at that point if that happened.
Yeah, we would have much bigger problems than the NBA at that point. But I think China needs to be clear. A Tiananmen-like event in Hong Kong would lead to massive sanctions, pushing China in very dramatic ways out of trade agreements. That could spark a Cold War, and we'd have to be very careful. It did not throw us into the Thucydides trap.
Now, let me close by telling you that as a response to your homework assignment, I happened to see that a movie, My People, My Country, was playing in Southern California this weekend, and that there were large crowds outside of it of Chinese Americans and Chinese people. So I went on Tuesday. It's a 3-hour propaganda film put out to honor the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic's founding. And it's 3 hours of propaganda told through 7 stories, beginning with the October 1949 flag raising in Tiananmen Square, the 1964 test of the atom bomb in China, the 1984 women's gold medal in L.A. in volleyball, the reunification with Hong Kong in 97, the landing of the Chinese astronauts in the Gobi Desert, the August 2017 military parade honoring the 90th anniversary of the PLA. It's beautifully done. And there was applause from this theater, which was half full on a Tuesday afternoon after 3 hours. And I thought to myself, the Chinese people are in love with what President Xi Jinping is doing. And I don't think Americans quite understand that because we focus on Hong Kong and not the 1.39 billion people that live outside of Hong Kong.
Exactly right. And one of the reasons I think Waiting is an important novel is because it's about the tension in China between rural and urban, which is an extraordinary divide in the country. And we tend to think of China as a monolithic block. It's very disaggregated, and there are mechanisms there that we need to understand if we're going to construct the kind of strategy to deal with China that you and I just talked about. And as I've mentioned to you before, my son-in-law is Chinese American. He's a physician. He was born here, doesn't speak a word of Mandarin. But as a result, I have some visibility into this Chinese American community. They're unbelievably loyal, patriotic. They think they've gotten the best deal in the world coming here. But they look across that Pacific Ocean the same way I, as a Greek American, look at Greece and its great achievements in antiquity, and I'm proud of those things. I think Chinese Americans look at China and they understand the power in lifting people out of poverty that has occurred there. On the other hand, all of us Americans, Chinese Americans, Greek Americans, Americans from everywhere, we need to be mindful of this competition that's unfolding in front of us in this 21st century.
My very last question. On Thursday, a week from today, the Nixon Foundation and the Wilson Center are doing an all-day seminar led off by Matt Pottinger, the new Deputy National Security Advisor, ending up with 3 former ambassadors to China on the U.S.-PRC relationship. We call it the Nixon Forum. We're going to do it annually. That's what we call Track 2. That's where people come and they talk to each other. Does Track 2 do anything, Admiral? And would you explain it to our audience so they understand why Track 2 matters?
Sure. Track 1 is formal official diplomacy. That's when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo goes to Beijing, meets the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. That's a summit between President Trump and Kim of North Korea. That's Track 1. Track 2 diplomacy is when non-governmental organizations come together to compare views. A typical example from my zone would be a group of 4 retired Navy admirals meet with 4 retired Chinese admirals. All of them maybe in their early 60s, so mature people, and they have a dialogue about the challenges that go back and forth. Track 2 does matter because then, in the case I'm giving you, those admirals come back and they call up their active duty friends in the Pentagon. They call up the current Secretary of Defense and they say, you know, I had this conversation with these 4 Chinese retired admirals. Here's what they're thinking. Here's how they view the South China Sea. Here's what they think about Taiwan. It's a way to exchange views, maybe build a little confidence in a non-official setting, far, far away from the glare of publicity. So Track 2 matters. I'll give you a last example, university to university. When I was the dean at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, we had a very vibrant relationship with the leading School of International Relations in Moscow. And we exchanged students, we exchanged faculty, we got to know each other. I think there is benefit there, but at the end of the day, the real traction is Track 1 diplomacy, but Track 2 can help.
Next week, hypersonics, cyber, anti-satellite weapons, and the rest. Admiral Stavridis, thank you for joining us, spending extra time with us today. And I'll wait for my next homework assignment until next week because I'm almost done.
Well, it sounds like my homework assignment is to see a 3-hour Chinese movie. So
Yes.
I'm off to do that this weekend. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Admiral.